something new being?
Just a new focus on what I'm calling not a Pax Americana. Not a Pax America. Which I think is kind of relevant to where we are in today, but I actually want to, when you're ready, I got a question for you.
We can go right now.
Okay. So, now how old are you?
27.
You're 27. Okay, so you were born in what year?
97.
Born in 97. And do you by any chance know what year your parents were born?
I think my dad was born in 61 and my mom in 64.
Okay, so basically, your parents were babies when JFK was killed. And me too. So that was a long time ago. And so I'm always curious as to why anybody who's 27 would have any interest in this ancient history. You know, why do a podcast on JFK's assassination? I mean, seriously, why?
I'm just fascinated with the story. And I should preface this with the fact that I only know I know a surface level. I know enough to be curious about what actually happened that day.
Yeah.
And I think even if it were true that it was just an assassination and it was this patsy guy who, for whatever reason, acted alone and did this, and there's no connection to the government or there's no relation to what happened in Cuba or to anyone that might have been upset like the mob or the CIA, even if it was just this lone actor, I think the significance of having a president assassinated and then all of the mistakes that we've known, whether it's the magic bullet or, well, even with the magic bullet, the chain of evidence that was not there, all of these things, it just makes you question what actually happened. And as a guy who enjoys the truth, sees the value in the truth, I think that there's importance in that. And this story is kind of a hallmark for that, for the truth, and how we as the public don't always get the truth. And there's kind of this shady behind the scenes act going on, and we only ever so rarely get a glimpse behind that curtain to see what's really going on back here. What do we not know that we think we do?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, as someone who has grown up my whole life, in a sense, right after this assassination, you know, I've kind of gone through it. There's been a number of investigations. The original one done in 1964 was the Warren Commission. Then later they reopened it, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations did a reopening and a reinvestigation and call in witnesses they didn't have before. So in a sense, a better investigation because time had passed and more things were known. And that concluded in 1979. And then we have a new investigation that broke out in the early 2000s as a result of basically the movie JFK. So have you seen JFK?
I have not.
Okay, you haven't seen JFK. Okay. So, I mean, if people are interested and they're not quite sure what the story or stories are, JFK, Oliver Stone's movie, is a great start. And then Oliver Stone did a documentary. You see, Oliver Stone got in a lot of trouble doing a Hollywood depiction of this case. And the case that Oliver Stone took was not the JFK assassination per se. It was later, in the late 60s, when the district attorney of New Orleans brought a case against people he thought were conspirators against JFK. And that was the Garrison case. And he was suing Clay Shaw, who was a prominent businessman in New Orleans. And they brought that to trial, and to bring a case against Clay Shaw and other co-conspirators, they had to dredge up all this evidence from the assassination, including this magic bullet theory. So all of that's in JFK. That's a great, despite the fact that it's somewhat Hollywood and characters are condensed and saying things that they never really said, but, you know, it's
dramatized a little bit.
that's par for the course. And then as a result of the JFK movie, where Oliver Stone basically says all this stuff is still being hidden from the public, there was a huge groundswell to uncover this stuff. And Congress passed a law in 92, the JFK Records Act, which said, okay, we're going to get all this stuff released. And it's all going to be released by 2017. Everything the government has. And we're going to set up this thing called the Assassinations Review Board. That's going to look, if anyone thinks that something shouldn't be released, we have a board that's going to look at that. So there was this process by which everything was supposed to be released unless somebody had a really good reason, right? And they had to bring that reason to this review board. And that review board concluded its findings and said, okay, release everything. And boom, 2017 rolled around and stuff wasn't released. And it was kind of kicked down, the can was kind of kicked down. So Trump was president and he had said, I will release this stuff. And then it was like, well, I'm not going to release it all. And then Biden came in and said, yeah, I'm going to release it. And then he was like, well, I'm not going to release it all. In fact, I'm going to even let the CIA have a bigger hand in deciding what should be released and what shouldn't. And so here we sit, 2024, and there's still about 3,500 documents that haven't been released in full per the law that Congress passed. And it's like, okay, I mean, you don't have to be an alchemist to think if Lee Harvey Oswald was some nutcase that just shot the president because he was on, he was mad at him or something, and he had no ties to intelligence and no ties to the mob, no ties to Cuba or whatever, there wouldn't be any need to hide anything, would there?
Especially 3,500 documents.
Yeah, so many years later. And so anyway, no wonder people are suspicious, because the average person would say, well, what's there to hide?
Doesn't add up.
Yeah. So one of the things in thinking about this today is like the 61st anniversary of JFK's assassination. I was thinking about it, and I realized that JFK was taking the country in a certain direction that I believe a lot of powerful people didn't want it to go. Whether that was motive to kill him or I don't know, but Oliver Stone thinks so. And in his 2021 documentary, and if people want to watch this, it's called JFK Revisited. It's his documentary about what happened since the release of his fictional or based on a true story JFK movie from 91. Kind of brings us up to date with new things that have been released, and kind of gives his chance to give a more, shall we say, journalistic approach to it. And then last year, Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien did a podcast called Who Killed JFK. Did you ever hear about that?
No.
So all those podcasters out there, you might want to check into that. It's, I think, a 9 or 10 part, half-hour segments. Who Killed JFK? You should listen to it.
Pretty good?
Yeah, it's pretty good. And it's the Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien version of this comes to a lot more conclusions, shall we say, about who did it than Oliver Stone did. But the thing they have in common is the question of why. Why was JFK killed? And if there, like you say, if Oswald was acting alone, or there was a conspiracy, what was up? What was the need for this guy to get killed? And I think it goes back to this Pax Americana speech in 1963. JFK was given a commencement speech. Hey, one college gets the president every year, right? So this American University in Washington, D.C. got the president as its commencement speaker. And he gets up in 1963, June, and he gives this speech. And it's all about where he thought the country needed to go. So if you can
ready to watch it?
Kind of watch this thing, I think it's...
We'll see. This may, for those just listening, this may or may not be included. I got to check YouTube's guidelines, but it's John F. Kennedy's greatest speech on peace.
Okay. That's just part of it was like a half-hour speech, and you can find the text of that online as well. Not a Pax Americana. Okay, he says that straight, pretty close up. He's saying basically, let's talk about world peace. We don't ever talk about world peace. So I'm going to talk about it. And I'm not talking about a Pax Americana. That kind of peace enforced by armaments.
Is that what Pax Americana means?
Well, Pax Americana is like a modern version of what they called, the Roman Empire, and then the British Empire was Pax Britannia. So in the history of empires, that's a lot of times that's exactly what history is. It's just this empire did this, and then this empire conquered them, and this empire conquered that. That's only one way to look at history, sort of the big empire view. But okay, if you look at that, what you find is that the era of empire comes and goes, and this empire rises. And Europe had a history of, are the Germans going to be running the show? Or is Napoleon going to run the show? Is Britain going to run the show? Are the Russians going to run the show? You have these empires, and you have this whole historical era of imperial expansion. So the United States, we are part of Britain's imperial expansion. And so Britain came over to what we now call North America, established colonies. These were all colonies established as business enterprises. A lot of times people don't really kind of realize our own history, that the colonies were, for the most part, chartered corporations. They were business enterprises, and certain, board of directors or whatever went to King George and got permission to go venture out into these lands and, kind of set up shop and exploit the resources and export them back to England. Some of the colonies were founded by proprietors. William Penn is an example. William Penn, gets permission. He can set up kind of any government he wants. He kind of gets to run the show. He calls it Pennsylvania. So you have this era of colonial expansion of empire. The Dutch were here. They founded a city called New Amsterdam, which later the British took and called it New York. The Germans were here. The Portuguese, the Spanish were huge. And they had Florida and Georgia and Cuba. And so at the time of the emergence of, shall we say, the American Empire, because I would pin this on the Spanish-American War. So the Spanish-American War is not widely taught in school. Everybody's like, what? So the Spanish-American War was perhaps the most significant U.S. war that you can study, because what happened was the United States ostensibly stopped the Spanish Empire from being in control of lands in the Western Hemisphere, and put a stop to all European expansion here. We wanted it. We wanted to go across the continent, and that was called Manifest Destiny. That was coined by a journalist who was writing about this right that we have to do this, and this whole notion that we're going to go from sea to shining sea, right? And when we got done with that, it's about 1900. We've occupied everything. We've gotten Texas. We've gotten territorial ambitions and maps lined out. We got the Louisiana Purchase. France is out of the Western Hemisphere. We got the Louisiana Purchase. We got Alaska bought during the Civil War. So the United States is on this track to sort of fill out the North American continent, and it comes to an end. We've got to the Pacific right about this time, and the Spanish are kind of in our way. The leaders of the United States were very interested in having like a canal. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a president at one point, was very involved prior to being president in a lot of these sort of expansionist dreams. And one of his was, let's get a canal so we can ship through Central America and not have to go around South America to go from one coast to the other and in shipping. And so there were expeditions in Central America to figure out if Nicaragua or Panama or something was the place to go. And the notion that Roosevelt and all these guys had was, if we need it, we're going to get it. It doesn't matter who lives there now, okay? This is America. This is the United States. So we find the Spanish are in our way, and there's plans being drawn up by they called it the Department of War then. They were more honest, I think, in the beginning. It was the Department of War. It wasn't the Pentagon or the Department of Defense. The Department of War drew up some plans of how to get rid of the Spanish. And there was an incident in 1898 where a ship was blown up in Havana Harbor. It's called the USS Maine. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, was kind of the clarion call. And within days of the destruction of the U.S. Maine, the newspaper barons, William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer, all these guys blamed the Spanish. There hadn't even been an inquiry yet. It was like nobody knew quite what was going on, but they say they interviewed some anonymous sources who had been on board, some sailors who were in this hospital in Florida from it. And based upon some of these credible but anonymous sources, we know the Spanish did it. It was a torpedo. It was a mine. There were different versions of what it was. But that was it. And now we're going to go to war against Spain. And to me, it's like this playbook of having some incident happen, some explosive incident happen, where you're kind of thinking maybe we need to go to war, maybe there's going to be a war, and then this inciting incident happens, maybe most likely under mysterious or shocking circumstances, whether it's the USS Maine, it's the Gulf of Tonkin, it's 9/11, whatever it is, you have this pattern that there's this outrageous assault on the United States, and we've got to respond with war. And as soon as the ducks were in a row, U.S. Navy attacked the Philippines. What? I thought, okay, well, the Philippines were a Spanish holding, like Cuba and all these Spanish holdings. But the first line of attack was on the Philippines, because there was fear that the Japanese might get in there. So the Japanese had an empire going. So again, there's these maneuvers of the Game of Thrones, the maneuver of the empires. So the U.S. set out to basically take the Spanish holdings, even if they weren't in our Caribbean, in our backyard. So we conquered the Philippines, took Guam on the way, and then hit Cuba, Puerto Rico, and what's the other one? Not Haiti. Haiti and Dominican Republic were left alone, but there was other islands out there. So in the Caribbean. So basically, by 1900, the American empire had emerged. A Pax Americana. We're going to take control of the Western Hemisphere. We're going to take whatever land we want. We are the power in control. And we hadn't been that way before. And there was even the president at the time of the Spanish-American War was McKinley. And McKinley was like, well, I don't want to go to war. And it was like, oh, yeah, we'll get you to go to war. And they did. They kind of shoved McKinley into going to war.
And it was all predicated on the sinking of the Maine.
The sinking of the Maine was the last straw. There had been other things building up, and the newspapers were publishing a lot of things. it really reminds me, you look at the buildup to the Spanish-American War, it looks like the buildup to attacking Iran now. It's like, let's think of everything we possibly can to make them look bad, and then there'll be an incident, and maybe then we can go and attack them. So I'm really hoping that we don't attack Iran. But that's why I think in some ways JFK's assassination is significant to the very news headlines we're seeing today, because what Kennedy did is he wanted to go away from Teddy Roosevelt's Pax Americana. And the reason he wanted to do that, and this comes out pretty clearly in these two documentaries I mentioned, Oliver Stone's JFK Revisited and then the podcast, Who Killed JFK, that Kennedy inherited a lot of stuff when he became president in 1960. One of the things he inherited was a full-blown plan by the CIA to invade Cuba. And they had been working on this for years, and Kennedy didn't know anything about it. But when he gets in office, he's elected in 1960, he's inaugurated early 1961. When he starts getting his transitional briefings or whatever, they say, hey, by the way, and Allen Dulles was the CIA chief at the time from the Eisenhower years, by the way, we're planning this operation. All of these Cuban exiles are going to go and they're going to retake Cuba, and they're going to kick that commie Castro out, and we're going to retake, we're going to help them retake. By the way, we might need U.S. troops involved. The idea is, Mr. President, that these ex-Cubans, these Cuban exiles are going to do it. They have a big enough army. We've been training them in Louisiana, whatever. We're ready to go, but there might be some backup we got to do. And Kennedy's like, no. It's one thing for the Cuban exiles to retake their homeland. It's a completely other thing for the United States to take a side and to back some invasion of their island. We're not going to do it. And they're like, well, you got to do it. So there was this kind of like tension, right? And this is 1961. The Bay of Pigs goes down, and Kennedy doesn't supply the airstrike supports that the CIA wanted.
And it's day of, right, that he decides to pull it.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think he ever did want to do it.
No, but day of was the realization there was going to be no air cover,
yeah,
right?
And, you can go in and see whether you think Dulles lied to Kennedy or Kennedy lied to Dulles, or who was wishful thinking, or maybe it was a little bit of both. But so it was a disaster. Lots of people were killed. Lots of these Cuban exiles coming up on the beach were killed. And that was something that Kennedy was just livid about. And it was like he talked in private about getting rid of the CIA. He fired Dulles and put in somebody he trusted, a guy named McCone. Next year, 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. We're back to Cuba, only this time Castro, who's pretty nervous that the U.S. is going to invade, is going to retry Bay of Pigs, and there were actually people talking about, well, let's give it another shot. Castro taps the Soviet Union, who's the other empire, superpower. They're starting to call empires superpowers after a certain point. I haven't figured out exactly when, but this notion of superpower started to emerge, that we're not an empire, we're a superpower.
Do you think that was with the bomb, the atomic bomb? Do you think that was kind of that next evolution?
Where, I don't know. I'm just surmising that superpower sounds a lot different than empire.
Softer branding.
Yeah, a little bit more.
A little more palatable.
Yeah. So anyway, we've still got these empires, right? So Castro starts to go to Khrushchev and says, I'm going to need some help down here. And Khrushchev says, fine, let's put some missiles on your island. It creates this huge problem. And there's actually a movie that I think is pretty good about that, which is called 13 Days. In fact, it has Kevin Costner in it as well. So Kevin Costner plays this district attorney, Jim Garrison, in JFK. And then later he plays one of JFK's friends and advisors, Kenny, in the White House as they try to deal with this Cuban Missile Crisis. It took 13 days from the time when the U.S. intelligence said they're bringing in these missiles, and it just built up, and people thought there were maybe going to be a nuclear war. The reason there wasn't is because Kennedy picked up the phone and he talked to Khrushchev. And he tried to find back channels to Khrushchev, and he tried to find any way he could to talk about what was going on in the Caribbean and in Cuba. And he made a deal. And the deal was basically, you pull your missiles out of Cuba. Don't put any nuclear weapons in Cuba. Turn back and go. And if you do that, we promise to never invade Cuba, and we will pull missiles we've already got targeted on Moscow out of Turkey. But we'll do that later so no one thinks it's a quid pro quo. It'll be a little dance. But they made a deal. And in that deal, we averted nuclear war. Come June 1963, Kennedy's taking a new course, not a Pax Americana. It's going to be the kind of peace that we seek is not with the force of arms, but we're going to talk to each other. It's a peace for everybody, not just Americans. It's a peace for all time, not just now. He's got this completely different vision. And by the end of the year, he's dead. And his successor, Lyndon Johnson, escalates the Vietnam War, and we have had Pax Americana ever since. So I think there's a very compelling case for why Kennedy was killed. And what we're seeing now, this is, I think, significant to people your age. What we're seeing now is the end of American empire, the end of Pax Americana. You can call it populism. You can call it a right-wing shift all around the world. You can call it fascism. You can put all these kind of labels on it you want. But what's going on right now is the world is voting us off the island. The world doesn't want Pax Americana. The world doesn't want any more Iraqs and any more Afghanistans. The world doesn't want any more Ukraines and Gazas. The world wants out of that. And a new thing is emerging as we speak that I think is as significant as the Spanish-American War or as World War II or the assassination of Kennedy, and that's the formation of BRICS. Are you familiar with BRICS?
Absolutely.
Okay. So if people aren't familiar with BRICS, just remember B stands for Brazil, and R stands for Russia, and I for India, C for China, and S for South Africa. And there are 15 or so other members or allies. And so what's happening now is everybody else outside the EU and the United States is getting together. And they're saying, we don't want it. We don't want endless war. We don't want endless economic exploitation. We don't want to have to use the dollar. We don't want to have to use American petroleum. We don't want to have to do what Washington says. We're going to go and make our own deals. And what I'm seeing is the United States going, oh my God, let's see if we can go to war against Russia and China and India all at the same time. Do we have the capacity? Who's going to run for president and work this out? And I think it's crazy. It's like I think the dance is over. I think Pax Americana is over. And I think that's kind of exciting. It's almost like now we can get back to what Kennedy was talking about. Now we can get back to this notion that you can sit down with Kim Jong-un. You can sit down with North Korea. You can sit down with Assad in Syria. You can sit down with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. You can sit down with Netanyahu. You can sit down with people and try to hammer out peace. And that would be good. And since the United States doesn't want to take leadership on that, and Britain doesn't want to take leadership on that, other people are doing it. Other people, China in particular, are taking upon themselves to try to get negotiations going.
My concern is that transition doesn't flow easily. I look at the emergence of BRICS and the point in time that we are currently at almost as the emergence of the Allies and the Axis during World War II, this formation of powers coming together for a common cause. And I don't know how Trump fits into all of this. Had Biden still been president, or had Kamala still been in office, I would have been a little more solid on that stance, that there was going to be some conflict that emerges from that. With Trump, I don't know. But it feels like these powers are starting to splinter off and group up based on aligned goals. And we're still adversarial to those countries. I mean, especially with Ukraine right now. I think Blinken came out and said that he's going to make sure that we can send every dollar we have available to Ukraine prior to Trump taking office, which is kind of a scary thought. They also, I believe just today, Ukraine struck deep within Russia with U.S. missiles. Biden had given him the okay to do that. Kind of alarming.
And I just read also today that they got some leaked intel documents out of Britain, and that there's been a working group in Britain working on a protracted war with Russia since way before the Russian invasion. The idea being we want to end the Russian Empire. We want to destroy them. And we think we can do that by having a war that takes so long that
war of attrition.
War of attrition. So, I mean, Ukrainians have to die, okay. Russians have to die, okay. Because in the end, Britannia is gonna come out ahead. And we know from several sources that the peace negotiations that started 2 months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine by Turkey were scuttled by the British. And I always kind of thought, well, British are maybe carrying water for NATO, which is carrying water for the U.S. But I think Americans fail to understand that Britain still thinks they got an empire going. And I don't think they're ready to say the U.S. is calling the shots yet. And so Britain has its own interests. MI6 has its own interests. When we think of who could have done this, who could have blown up Nord Stream.
I was just thinking that.
Who? Nobody thinks Britain, although that was the first country that Putin accused, was Britain. So Britain is in there. They got their own game going, and it just came to light that there's been a working group in their elite establishment talking about this war to overthrow Russia. So anyway, I mean, that Game of Thrones, that game of let's kill each other until we won, I think needs to go. I mean, I've always felt it needs to go. It's never sat well with me my entire life as I watch Vietnam and I watch Central American wars and I watch Iran-Contra and as I watch Iraq and Persian Gulf and Afghanistan. It's never sat well with me that the way you solve these problems is by killing more of their people than they kill of yours. That just seems to be, I don't know, Neanderthal or something. Excuse me, Neanderthals, you probably were way more peaceful than that. But anyway, so I think that what Kennedy was trying to do and what he was unable to do because he was killed, it reverberates to this very day and to the very headlines we're seeing today.
The parallels are scary. But I think his assassination goes to show that in trying to enact that change and bring about some real form of peace, whatever is going on behind the curtains isn't just going to go away quietly. I mean, if there was some group within our own government that aided or abetted that, or the CIA did kill him, it makes you think, well, if we try to bring about that peace today, who are they going to whack somebody off? I mean, we've had multiple attempts already on Trump that have just kind of been swept away, which is amazing to watch. So could they assassinate a president again in 2024 or 2025, technically?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how well they do it and throw our attention away from it. So one of the things I wanted to mention along the Kennedy lines is that a lot of stuff has come out. that wasn't around for decades. And when they started to release things in the 90s, there was this guy named Jeff Morley. He was a reporter for the Washington Post in the early 90s. And Congress passed this JFK Records Act, and Jeff Morley and I are roughly the same age. And so, he was interested in that whole Kennedy thing. And so documents started coming out. And in the early 90s, the only way you could see these documents was to go down to the National Archives in Maryland and look at them, sit down at a desk and start looking at them. So nothing was online at that time. So Jefferson did this. Jeff went down there and he started looking at things. And one of the things that came out that he found that was new was evidence that the CIA was watching Oswald. Now, if you do a cursory examination of Oswald's biography, one of the things that seems like a pretty obvious wow was that Oswald was a Marine who defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, kind of in this whole Cold War thing. He defected to the Soviet Union, and then he came back and resumed his life in Texas and Louisiana. Nobody does that. Nobody defects to another country, your arch enemy. Nobody goes over and trains fighters in Afghanistan and then just comes back and says, well, I made a mistake.
I changed my mind.
Yeah.
I like it better over here.
I'm good. And then you're just like not watched and nobody knows anything about you. I mean, that just always seemed like kind of weird. Like, really? And so Jeff Morley uncovered some hard evidence in something as weird as routing slips. He was able to find this chain of custody of some of these documents. And what he basically found was that Langley, let's call Langley as the sort of the head of the CIA. Langley wasn't telling the CIA in Mexico about Oswald. When Oswald was arrested in 1963, November 22nd, 1963, and was held in jail that weekend, everybody wanted to know who Oswald was. What's this guy? Just like you want to know who was Tom Crooks, who's up on the roof shooting at Trump. I mean, everybody wants to know. And it's amazing how much people seem to know about Oswald. I'm amazed that the newspapers were able to put these stories together without the internet. But the next day stories, Oswald's they're coming out with this notion that Oswald was a Cuban sympathizer. He was a communist sympathizer. And the origins of that information are hard to trace, but most daily newspapers were hinting at the idea that Oswald may have been doing something in conspiracy with either the Russians or the Cubans, the commies, because after all, Oswald had defected over there, but he came back. So what side is he on? And the CIA was watching all of this. And they knew who Oswald was when he came back into the country, and they had people surveilling him, opening his mail, and handling him the whole time he was here. So it was like he wasn't a mystery to the CIA. He wasn't a mystery to the FBI. But suddenly, after the assassination, he's a lone gunman that nobody knew anything about. And the CIA in Mexico had this evidence that he had been there. In September, so like just a couple months before the assassination, this guy, this lone nut, is down here in Mexico, and he's going to the Cuban embassy, and he's going to the Russian embassy, and he seems to be interested in getting visas so he can go on to the Soviet Union and he can visit Cuba. He's getting these things in September. And the CIA in Mexico City calls up Langley and says, what's with this guy? Can you tell us about him? We know he was here. What can you guys tell us about him? And Langley says, nothing. We don't know anything about him. Well, Jefferson Morley and others have found that the CIA knew a whole lot of files this thick on what Oswald was doing, who his handlers were. One of his handlers was a guy named George Joanides. And this is also something that Jeff Morley researched heavily. Nobody had ever heard the name George Joanides in all those decades since the Kennedy assassination. The only time his name ever came up was in the 70s, because when the House Select Committee on Assassinations, this House of Representatives body, created an investigative group to reinvestigate the Kennedy assassination, they wanted to have someone from the CIA as a liaison to sort of help get information back and forth between the investigators and the CIA. And the CIA gave them George Joanides. He was a retired CIA operative. Come out of retirement, you got time on your hands, you're not working. Go ahead and be the liaison. And that's all they knew about him. Later, Jeff Morley finds out that George Joanides was an active CIA operations manager at the time of the assassination in Miami. He was running everything that had to do with the Cubans. And he was running a covert support operation with people who were ex-Cuban students in exile. And these students in exile were the ones who said, yeah, Oswald is pro-Castro, and sends that information to the newspapers on November 22nd, 1963. So there's a lot of detail. I'm sorry I can't go into it all, but suffice it to say that when information's coming out about Oswald, what we're finding out is more and more about how he was known, he was being watched, he was being managed, and the people who were doing Cuban operations knew all about this and wanted Oswald, it seems, to appear to be pro-Castro. And there's a lot of ways they tried to do that, but having Oswald, a mystery man, who, if he's not a lone nut, maybe he's pro-Castro or maybe he's anti-communist. We're not sure. Confusion, good tactic in the playbooks that go along these lines. Was the USS Maine destroyed by a torpedo, or was it a mine, or was it an internal explosion? Now we know, basically in 1974, the admiral in the Navy, Rickover, did a modern investigation of the USS Maine and said it was a result of an internal fire in their coal supplies, and that there was no evidence that a mine or torpedo had done any damage to it. So these mysterious incidents and these shady characters and confusion are part of the playbook to keep us guessing and keep us saying, well, I guess we'll never know. I mean, if I hear another journalist or commentator or podcaster say, well, the truth will never come out, I guess we'll never know, I just want to smack them, because why not? I want to truth smack you. Why can't we find out? Why can't we know?
Well, it's important to remember in all of this that at a base level, all of this proves the CIA lied.
Yes.
At a fundamental level, because they said he's not on our radar, we don't know, he came out of the blue. And in painting all of these distraction routes that you could go down, people aren't asking the question of, well, did we have anything to do with this? They're being directed towards, oh, maybe it was the Russians. And if you don't fall into that, well, it's the Cubans are right there. And he's obviously a Cuban sympathizer, so...
And then there's the mob.
And then there's the mob.
And in fact, there's a movie being made. It'll come out, I think, in a couple of years, that takes the mob angle. And the mob was involved because Oswald was killed by a low-level mobster named Jack Ruby. And the whole mob thing is a whole other bailiwick. And what the information that I've seen indicates is that the CIA would tap the mob to do some of their dirty work.
Well, and then you have the fact that Jolly West went and visited Jack Ruby. And then Jack Ruby just goes crazy. What? Jolly West, the guy that was behind MK Ultra, all of these LSD, that guy just went and randomly saw this guy.
And the famous thing about Ruby was, he was in jail for he obviously shot Oswald. No one disputes that. Although the question immediately arises in my mind is, why would Jack Ruby do that? And his stated reason was that he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of going through a trial. Does he really care about Jackie Kennedy so much he's willing to go to prison or the gas chamber to save her a little grief? I don't think so.
Yeah, that one's a stretch.
But I can't imagine what would possibly motivate Jack Ruby to kill someone on TV and face possible execution. They must have had some heavy-duty plan for him to agree to do that.
Or had something over him. I didn't know that he was a low-level mobster. That's when...
Well, low-level mobster in the sense that he was running... he ran a nightclub in Dallas, the Carousel. He's running prostitution. He's running drugs. He's running guns. All the kind of things that you associate with casinos and...
Would be connected somehow.
Yeah. So Ruby was into all that. He wasn't, he wasn't Italian in that sense, but he had connections with Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana and all these guys that were Italian or had interest in, had casinos in Cuba, and they lost their casinos. The mob had an interest in getting Cuba back away from Castro because Castro shut all the corruption down, and they lost a lot of money and. So just business, but hey. So Jack Ruby did have, he was in the orbit of mobsters. So I say low-level mobster in the sense that I don't know all the crimes that Ruby committed. I don't know if Ruby had ever been a hitman before, for instance, and if so, who paid him. But you'd have to pay some guy an awful lot to have done the Oswald job. You'd have to either have something on him like, we're going to kill your entire family if you don't do it, Jack, or they had some kind of plan to get him out.
And the I'm going to kill you is or you and your family is a strong motivator if you believe they just whacked the sitting president. The idea that they can't touch you is kind of evaporated from your mind.
Yeah. So there was some kind of strong motive for that guy. It wasn't just loving Jackie Kennedy. But there's that whole mob thing that's sewn in. And sometimes it seems to be sewn in because mobsters are willing to do illegal things that maybe some CIA agents don't want to do. And also because the mob might be able to be a patsy of some kind, a distraction of some kind, so that you can keep the attention away from who's really pulling the strings. And that's kind of what you were alluding to, that a lot of this confusion and stuff only helps deflect attention away from where we should be looking. And it's important to keep forging ahead. One of the other things I was going to mention that was a recent development is the magic bullets. And I did a Truthsmack piece called The Magic Bullets, implying that there are more than one magic bullet. And so the forensic evidence around Kennedy's assassination has always been really difficult to track. And you have not only the typical crime scene investigation that you would need to do, finding the murder weapon, finding the shells, finding some way to tie that to the person who's been killed. If you find 3 rifles in the Texas books school book depository, which of the three is the murder weapon. So you have to you have the forensic investigation to tie the evidence to the murder. What's the murder weapon? And then is that murder weapon then tied somehow to your suspect? And so all this forensic evidence was around and kind of hard to deal with. And so they came up with a scenario in 1964. The Warren Commission came up with a scenario that 3 shots were fired. And they based the 3 shots were fired on, there were 3 shell casings in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository next to the rifle that apparently Oswald just dropped and ran. And there were many witnesses that said they heard 3 shots. So the Warren Commission said, okay, there were 3 shots, and they tried to deal with that. What we've learned since then is that there were probably more shots. At the time, witnesses were hearing anywhere from 2, 3, up to 5 shots, depending on which eyewitness you talk to, which is why eyewitnesses are sometimes difficult. But if there were 3 shots or 5 shots, one of the things you try to do is find the bullets. And that was a problem when they did the JFK went to the hospital and they tried to save his life. And so there were these Dallas doctors at Parkland Hospital that are doing their ER thing, and it's not working. And of course they're trying, because it's the president, probably a little bit longer than they would anybody else, but they can't revive him and he's dead. They then ship his body to Washington, D.C., to do the autopsy. They would not allow the local medical examiner to do it. In fact, they even had almost a fist fight over the local coroner saying, no, this is Dallas. It's our murder investigation. I'm doing the autopsy. And they basically threw him up against the wall, so we're taking him. They took him not to Walter Reed Army Hospital, where they are typically doing autopsies. They take him to Bethesda Medical Center, and they get a couple of Navy guys. And whenever Navy guys are doing something, make a note of it, because I think the Navy, just the study of the Navy and their Navy, whether it's Navy SEALs or whatever, the Navy's always involved in stuff, and yet they don't have the same image as like the CIA or something. But anyway, they took Kennedy's body to a Navy facility, and they had naval doctors look at him and do the autopsy. The autopsy doctors couldn't find enough bullets. So you got 3 shots, 3 casings, people saying there were 3 shots, but they can't find 3 bullets. And so the autopsy doctors were kind of at a loss. Where'd they go? Well, they probably were in the limousine, right? So they're talking to people, Secret Service, who were in charge of taking the limousine back to Washington, D.C., and trying to figure out where the bullets went. And then one of the crime scene investigators says, "Well, we found one. We found one in the street." And this guy named James Tague was standing across the street from the school book depository, and this shot went near him, and a piece of concrete flicked up and cut him in the face. And we found the bullet. Okay, so now the Warren Commission or the investigators have 3 shots only, but one of them missing. One of them missing Kennedy. So now they've only got 2 shots to figure out how all this damage was done. So that's where this magic bullet theory finally emerged. It was like, oh, instead of 1 bullet hitting Kennedy and killing him, and 1 bullet hitting Texas Governor Conley and injuring him, and that was 1 bullet. 1 bullet went through Kennedy and came out and went through Conley and then ended up in Conley's body. So there's 1 bullet that we can find, the one that's in Conley's thigh. 1 bullet's in the street. Where's the 3rd bullet? So these are the kind of forensic questions that these doctors are trying to figure out. Meanwhile, one of the pathologists in Maryland says that when they were putting Kennedy's body onto the table to do the autopsy, a bullet rolled out. So he picked it up. Here's a bullet. So we got a bullet in the street. We got a bullet in Connolly's thigh. And now we got a bullet that's popping out of Kennedy's body bag. Then you get a call from the autopsy doctors, get a call from the FBI lab in D.C. area saying, we got a bullet. We got the bullet that went through JFK and Connolly and we ended up in his thigh. We've got it because what happened was when Connolly was being taken care of in the ER, when Connolly, who survived, was being treated in the ER, this bullet fell out on a stretcher and we got it. So this is the magic bullet. This is the one that went through JFK and then Connolly ended up his thigh and we've got it off his stretcher and now it's in the FBI lab and we'll bring it over. So maybe that's one of those bullets they're looking for. Then this other guy says that they get a call from the Secret Service guys who are looking at the limo in D.C. and they found a bullet and they'll bring it in. So now we got the bullet that missed, the magic bullet showed up on Connolly's stretcher, and now a bullet from the limo. Last year, I think it was, this guy named Paul Landis comes forward. And Paul Landis is a Secret Service agent who was there. And he's famously one of the guys that's holding on for dear life when the JFK limo is heading off to the hospital and they're all hanging on. This guy named is Paul Landis. And he says last year, well, what happened was when we got to Parkland and they're taking the president into the ER and Jackie Kennedy's going into the ER, Paul Landis looks back and he sees a bullet in the back seat of the limo. He doesn't leave it in the back seat of the limo so that later a guy in Maryland finds it. He picks it up. And he says he put it on JFK's stretcher. Not Connolly's stretcher, JFK's stretcher. So we've got all kind of bullets. We got maybe 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 bullets, who knows? And the bullet that the Warren Commission and all the people who sort of promote this, Oswald did it. Point to this thing, it's called CE 399. It's a almost pristine bullet. It's obviously been marred, but
Pretty good shape.
but it's in pretty good shape for a bullet that caused 7 different wounds, So
Well, not only that, the fragments that were recovered were more in number than the fragments missing from the bullet, which might also
there's also the
cause some
fragments that they
questioning.
found and stuff. So that was kind of an interesting later development that we have the Paul Landis magic bullet coming forward, and if you ever really decide to punish yourself with this, read a book called Best Evidence by David Lifton. You ever heard of it?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it. There's that one. And have you heard of the book called Chaos? I don't know if that's, I'm trying to.
The reason I mentioned Best Evidence is that it's like super long and it's super drawn out, but it is like painstakingly detailed. And it's basically by this young guy who's a grad student at the time who said, I want to write about and study and research the forensic evidence. And he starts literally from day one. And, in chapter 3, he says, oh, wow, this kind of put me in this direction. And then chapter 5 is like, oh my God, this is going in this direction. And now we have a theory. And then something else comes out. It's like, okay, we scrapped that theory. Now we got this one. Just on and on and on. But it details everything that you could possibly ever want to know about JFK's autopsy. And there's so many crazy mysteries around that autopsy. 2 different ambulances, 2 different routes, maybe 2 different caskets coming out, different witnesses of when it happened, and it's a pretty incredible book for its detail. But one of the things that I learned from that book was that the FBI was in the room when the autopsy was being done, and these 2 agents, Seibert and O'Neill, were sent specifically to the autopsy by the FBI to get the bullets. They were crime scene investigators. So they're standing in the autopsy room and they're waiting and they're writing notes and they're seeing what the doctors say and they're looking, where are the bullets? Because they want to bag them. And they give a very different idea of JFK's injuries because they saw his body. And they give a very different idea of what the autopsy doctors were saying than the final autopsy report said. So again,
is that the discrepancy with whether it was a bullet hole in his throat versus a tracheotomy hole? Did you hear about that?
Yeah. What that was is the autopsy doctors found a bullet hole, an entrance in the back, below, kind of near the shoulder blade. And that entrance wound didn't go through. So it was like, where's the bullet? And the tracheotomy, there was confusion there because the Parkland doctors almost unanimously have said over the years that when they treated JFK in the emergency room, he had an entrance shot in the throat. And they, in fact, went out and did a press conference after JFK's body was taken by the Secret Service to Washington. They went out and gave a press conference and said he was shot from the front. And they described this bullet wound to the throat. When the autopsy doctors saw it, what they saw was a tracheotomy, because that's exactly what the ER doctors eventually did. They needed to help JFK breathe. And so they stuck a breathing tube in him, and they used the bullet hole as sort of the pilot hole, and they just cut it bigger and stuck the tube in. So when the autopsy doctors saw it, they thought it was a tracheotomy, and they didn't realize it was a wound. The Dallas doctors all said it was clearly an entrance wound, and the exit wound was on the back of his head. And they all said this. The autopsy doctors said, well, it looked like this was an exit wound. The throat was an exit wound. So the bullet hole in the back, it must have come through the throat. And so they were kind of monkeying with where was the hole in the back so that it could come from some way above and behind and go through his back and out his throat. But that's the end report was that the bullet hit him in the back, came out his throat, and then went into Conley. And then a second shot from the back hit him in the head. The Zapruder film, which nobody saw until the late 60s, I had all these dates, but I don't have them with me, but Geraldo Rivera showed the Zapruder film for the first time. I mean, everybody's seen, the Bigfoot film and the Zapruder film now, and it's like, but imagine that no one's seen it. And there's actually a YouTube video which shows the segment of Geraldo Rivera where he shows this for the first time, and the audience is just like freaking out when they see this. But it's pretty clear he's being shot from the front.
Yeah, he goes back into the left.
He goes back into the left, right. So the autopsy is highly suspect, and there's about 25 reasons to suspect its accuracy. And more details are coming out about more bullets and more angles, and this, and this ain't nothing new. When the Congress established this House Select Committee, the HSCA, in the 70s, they concluded that Kennedy was probably killed in a conspiracy. And that's as far as they would go. They didn't want to speculate as to who was involved. But the evidence they had by the mid-'70s was that there was more than one shooter. And why anybody this late in the game thinks that Oswald was shooting alone, I think that they're just ignoring a lot of stuff because there's just too much evidence that there was more than one shooter. And there's not even any real evidence that Oswald was one of them. The problem with Oswald is he's dead. So he couldn't testify. He did talk to the police. So there are some police reports. He talked to the press. He was never given an attorney. And every time he was asked, he said, "I did not shoot the president, and I'm a patsy," is one of the things he said, which, again, the word patsy, kind of an interesting one. He didn't say, "I didn't shoot anybody. You got the wrong guy." He said, "I'm a patsy," which is specifically saying, I'm the fall guy for somebody. And that was his statement. He was the fall guy. The guy is going to fall on his sword. But then he was killed in police custody by a local Dallas mob gangster kind of guy. And we don't get to know what he would have said. But there isn't any evidence that he was on the 6th floor. There wasn't any evidence that he had touched the gun.
Why do you think they're so hesitant to release these files? Why do you think it's been a slow trickle over the decades?
Well, the common pattern that I see with government disclosure is that whether it's Edward Snowden or it's the Warren Commission or it's the Iran-Contra affair, when there's a very thick streak of self-protection on the part of government. Nobody wants to admit they did anything wrong. No one wants to admit that they screwed up. None of us do. So, that's not just government. Everybody kind of wants to save face and look like they didn't screw up. So there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of government secrecy around embarrassment. That, to release this is going to make so-and-so look pretty bad, look pretty incompetent. But I think there's also complicity. So you got like incompetence and complicity, that they were involved somehow and they don't want that to be known. The idea that things are kept secret because we're protecting people out there from getting killed because our methods and our contacts are secret and we can't let that endanger American lives, I think is a crock. And I think I say that because the Bradley Manning or Chelsea Manning disclosures that WikiLeaks did on the Iraq War, which eventually got Julian Assange in prison, nobody got hurt. Nobody was killed as a result of Americans seeing how we would just fly around in helicopters and kill people, like the Mannings, what do you call it, the collateral murder video. Have you ever seen collateral murder?
Mm-hmm.
So, that's more, I think, embarrassment. It's like the military doesn't want you to know that good old boys are cranking Slayer and going around and just kind of killing people. They want us to think that there's some kind of organization to this, that we're carefully targeting terrorists when we do drone attacks or whatever. It's a surgical strike and there's minimal collateral damage. That's nonsense. Just go blow the place up, and they don't want us to know that that's what they do. So there's a huge, embarrassment and blowback factor to it. And when it comes to CIA operations, I think there's a whole lot of that, because what Kennedy saw in the Bay of Pigs was that the CIA was perfectly willing to do whatever it felt needed to be done. If the CIA leadership felt that Castro needed to be removed, then they were going to try to assassinate him. And plots to assassinate Castro came out finally in the 70s in the Church Committee hearings. Plots to assassinate other leaders. like Howard Hunt, Watergate burglar Howard Hunt was involved in overthrowing the government of Guatemala. And that all happened in the 50s. And he was involved in the Bay of Pigs in the 60s. And so you've got these sort of like, I think Nixon called it track two. It's like you've got sort of American policy, and then you've got this other thing going on. And whether that other thing is straight CIA or whether that other thing is some kind of specialized cell set up to look like a rogue element later, it's hard to tell because of the deception and the lies that the intelligence community tells. So you just can't trust anybody that's worked in intelligence. I'm sorry. As a journalist, whenever I see some former intelligence operative on, like, say, MSNBC making a comment, my first thought is, are you lying now or were you lying before?
Well, how about the 51 intelligence officials that came out and said, essentially, Russia had colluded with Trump? That was the Hunter Biden laptop. The 51 officials wrote the letter saying that the Hunter Biden laptop has all the hallmarks of Russian
disinformation campaign. Always look at the word hallmark because it doesn't mean anything.
And it was a complete lie.
It was a complete lie. Exactly. And who orchestrated that letter? Was some PR person for.
Well, the CIA element in all of this is fascinating because you have the fact that Kennedy essentially pissed off the whole organization with the Bay of Pigs. And at this time, this is the organization that is killing powerful leaders. This is what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so then we have that essentially turned on the home front, and we have our leader killed. And you wouldn't draw any parallels. You wouldn't say, well, what's the connection here? Who stands to gain the most by taking out this guy?
Yeah, and the CIA assassination operations weren't known to the Warren Commission. That came in the 70s. I mean, they didn't want anyone to know what they were doing. And they still don't want anyone to know what they're doing. And for anyone to think that whether it's Ray McGovern or Bob Baer or whoever, whatever smiling face is on that ex-CIA operative, you always have to ask yourself, are they lying now? Were they lying before? When are they lying? Is Valerie Plame telling us the truth now, or was Valerie Plame lying to us now? It's a hazard. And using military and intelligence sources in journalism is hazardous. I don't recommend it, except to say that this is what intelligence people are saying. This is an intelligence estimate that the CIA gave the president. You can say that.
Which has value, knowing what their story is and where they align. Not necessarily to take it at face value, but just to say, okay, this is what the intelligence people are saying.
Right.
Take it with a grain of salt.
Right.
What do you believe happened?
What do I believe happened? Well, to be honest with you, I don't think any scenario makes sense. And this is where I come on a lot of these controversial conspiracy theory kind of things, that there's a conspiracy theory, but the alternatives aren't any more believable. So, Oswald, lone shooter, kind of just wanted to be famous, whatever, wanted to get his 60 seconds of fame or whatever. That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think he had the skill to do it. I can't imagine that he just by coincidence got a job on the parade route where JFK's limo would be vulnerable to attack. It just doesn't make any sense to me that one guy could pull this off. But was the CIA involved? And if so, did the CIA keep the FBI out of it? Did the CIA keep the Secret Service out of it? Did the CIA do something that was so secretive that only 6 people know about it? It's pretty hard to pull off. And now Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien, with the under the direction of Dick Russell. Dick Russell really is the guy, the researcher that did all the work for Rob Reiner, really. And they named 4 assassins in the final episode of their podcast. And when I heard those 4 names, there were 4 names that I really hadn't heard before. I was kind of like, who cares? It was, Joe Blow or, Enrique so-and-so. I mean, who pulled the trigger is anticlimactic in some ways,
It's almost less important than why the trigger was pulled.
Exactly. They were paid. It's more important to know who paid them and what their goal was. And when you start to look at that, like for instance, I think that the mob may have had motive because the Kennedys were going after the mob. The Kennedy family had been involved in organized crime, with the dad being involved in rum running or something in the 30s or whatever, and a kind of a seedy kind of guy who's going to buy votes here and there, get his kids elected. There was a love-hate relationship between the Kennedys and mob families, and Bobby Kennedy in particular. He was young and idealistic. He wanted to go after him. He didn't want him to get away with it at a time when Hoover was saying there's no such thing as organized crime. And the mob had a lot of reasons to take out Kennedys. They had lost all their holdings in Cuba. Kennedys were cracking down on them. But I don't think the mob had the sufficient skills and assets to keep it a secret, to divert the public attention, to get Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was fired by Kennedy. When Kennedy's killed, Allen Dulles is put on the Warren Commission. It's like, can you get any more obvious than that? It's like having George Joannides be the CIA liaison for the House Select Committee. It's like, that's a pattern. Let's put the CIA in charge of the investigation. You can trust them. So the CIA, I think, is the most believable entity to have had the means to do it and to cover it up. I don't think the mob could have covered it up. And then it does, there's questions about how much did the Dallas police know and how much did the FBI know. And my conclusion on that so far is that they were not in the loop. It's like Hoover. One of the things that has never been released, one of those 3,500 documents, is the entire phone conversations that Hoover had with LBJ the day after and the days after the assassination. Johnson was on the phone with Hoover all the time over those few days, trying to figure out what was going on with the investigation. And Hoover's telling him things. This is before email, right? So he's on the phone. And all these conversations were taped. But later, they can't find the tapes. And okay, we found the tapes, but there's a 14-minute erasure. This is true. It reminds me of Watergate, where there was an 18-minute erasure or 17.5-minute erasure, whatever it was. So there's a tape of Hoover talking to Johnson, but a lot of it has been erased by somebody. And so then there's the transcript, and the famous part that came out was that Hoover says to Johnson, we think that Oswald was in Mexico. This gets back to then Oswald and what was he doing in Mexico. And Hoover tells Johnson, there's some evidence here that it was not Oswald after all. It was somebody who said he was Oswald. But it was like, we got pictures and stuff, and it's not Oswald. Of course, the CIA says we don't have the pictures, so somehow that we don't have them. But they've surfaced, and so there are these pictures of a guy who's clearly not Oswald coming and going from the Cuban or the Russian embassies or whatever. And Hoover himself says to Johnson, we're kind of confused as to whether that was Oswald or an imposter. I don't think Hoover knew. I think the CIA was was running the game. And Hoover's kind of like, Hoover's final conclusion is, we just got to pin this on Oswald. Because there's a famous thing called the Katzenbach memo, which was written is in writing, and we have that released, where I think he was a national security advisor for Kennedy, and then Johnson was saying, we just got to kind of pin this on Oswald because there's talk that he was a commie and there's talk that he was a fascist, and we don't want conspiracies to sprout up and get us into a war. So there was this motivation to cover up Oswald's actual activities and actual involvement, to pin it on him as a lone gunman, because that way we kind of just be done with it. Wacko killed him. Done with it. We don't have to talk about all these other connections and motivations, and like you mentioned, you don't have to talk about CIA involvement. It's a good way to sort of like just get it done. But you have CIA apparently trying to align Oswald with Castro. And all the headlines that came out the day after the assassination saying that Oswald was a pro-Cuban, pro-Castro sharpshooter. Somebody's trying to make it look like Castro did it. It's, in a sense, that's the first conspiracy theory. The first conspiracy theory in JFK's assassination came out in the newspapers the next day that said that somehow Oswald was connected to Cuba and that maybe Castro was calling the shots. Now, of course, we know when Castro heard the news, because there was a French journalist in the room with him, he was going, "Oh my God, now everything's going to change." Castro, it wasn't like, we got him. It was like, oh my God. So, Castro wasn't calling the shots on Kennedy's assassination, but there was an attempt to
pin it on him,
spin it that way early on.
Which draws the question of why and for what purpose.
So I think that the FBI and I think the Secret Service also were being managed. They weren't on the loop, I don't think. But you never know. And maybe we will know.
Say the CIA did do it, or some portion of our government was involved, and maybe it's proven definitively in those remaining 3,500 documents. Does anything change if those were to be released to the public and we had definitive, concrete proof that our government was involved in some way?
I think the CIA might be dismantled. And I think that would be a good thing. Personally, I think it'd be a good thing. The CIA was created in 1947, the National Security Act, after World War II, and it kind of became a fundamental purveyor of Pax Americana. So I have no problem with the CIA going away. I think they've done a lot of damage, and they've burned a lot of bridges with the rest of the world. And maybe Donald Trump is the kind of guy that might do that. I don't know. I find Trump hard to read.
Especially on this issue.
Yeah. It's like I saw a snippet of him being interviewed by Joe Rogan during the campaign, and Joe Rogan said, "Will you release the Kennedy documents?" You said at some point to somebody, "Boy, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't want them released either." And Trump says to Joe Rogan at that moment, which was not just a few months ago, the only reason that I didn't release those during my presidency was because I had advisors telling me that it would probably be good to not do it. And he specifically mentions Michael Pompeo as head of CIA, who Trump thinks is a great guy who I wouldn't trust to walk my grandmother across the street. But guys like Pompeo and others, and I think that Trump relies on people that he likes. Like he relies a lot on Peter Navarro. He relied a lot on Peter Navarro regarding China and COVID. And Peter Navarro wrote the encyclopedia on election fraud, thought for sure the election was stolen. And I think that Trump's confidence that the election was stolen didn't come from his own research. It came from him thinking, Peter Navarro's a good guy. That election was stolen. Mike Pompeo is a good guy. Those documents should probably not be released. But he says to Joe Rogan, this time I'm going to do it. And I'm going to do it real soon.
Do you think he actually will?
I have no idea. He doesn't always do what he says. So I don't know.
The only reason I would be hesitant that anything would change is because he presumably already knows, having been president and saying what he said on the issue. So why wouldn't you try to shake anything up?
I don't think he knows.
You don't think he knows?
I don't think he read those documents. It's kind of like, and I'm just basing this on a little Joe Rogan interview. So I don't really have any inside information, but it looked to me like he was basically saying, well, they showed me these files and I kind of started taking a look at it. And, I was told, just let it go. Don't release them. So I didn't. It's not like he read through them. Like he's up there in the White House studying. I don't see Donald Trump as that kind of guy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's reading at night.
Yeah, sitting up staring at these
got
old documents.
30 newspapers around him to see what's going on in the world. I think he relies real heavily on people. But he's so suspicious and feels that he has been victimized so much by the FBI, at least, that if anybody would be willing to close the door on the CIA, it might be him. It certainly wouldn't have been Kamala Harris or Joe Biden.
Have you looked into the Nixon connection with Watergate and the CIA?
Yeah.
What do you make of that? We might have to save that. We pushed it a little longer. We might have to save that for the next one. But you are aware of kind of that CIA connection and Nixon saying, "I know what you guys did."
Yeah. The whole Bay of Pigs thing. Yeah. That was the famous thing that he said was that in the Watergate thing, John Haldeman heard him say, if the CIA goes after this investigation, it'll open up that whole Bay of Pigs thing again. And Haldeman understood that to mean the Kennedy assassination, this whole mess we've been talking about. So the Watergate connection is huge.
For someone that isn't very well read on this issue, what would you recommend? Best Evidence, that book?
I wouldn't recommend that unless you're really passionate about it.
You're ready to go down the rabbit
so
hole.
long and but if you're the kind of person who says, well, I'd like to see how somebody changes their mind 3 or 4 times during the course of a 10-year investigation, then you might like it. I think that, the quick answer is those 2 things I mentioned, JFK Revisited, Who Shot JFK podcast, and the JFK movie with Kevin Costner. I think that's a great introduction to all the issues and go from there.
I'll have to check those out, especially that podcast. That'd be interesting to hear.
And also you can check out Truthsmack.
Yes, plug all your stuff.
Truthsmack at Substack, truthsmack.substack.com.
Do you want to plug the Abu Francis one, the Catholic memory?
No, let's just
leave it at Truthsmack for those.
Truthsmack, The Last Kennedy Files, Truthsmack, the No Pax Americana. There might be something new, but I've got a few things up there, the Magic Bullets and the Last JFK Files.
And be on the lookout for potentially more coming down the pipe. Okay, Steve, thanks for doing this, man.
Thank you.